I'm going to speak about the ESDP and CSDP missions or operations, achievements and shortcomings. Well, it is not easy to do this. I shall try my best. I will speak briefly about the military operations, about civilian operations, and then I will try to evaluate these briefly. Then I will make some remarks about Europe's weakness in terms of basically military operations, and I will then make some, I will give some reasons for a stronger Europe, or as we just learned from Robert Cooper, perhaps we could say a better organized Europe. And finally, I will make some recommendations focusing on a particular type of operations and putting all together what the EU has and what it can merge in order to do that in the future. Sorry, that way we are. Moving on. So first I speak about the military operations. There are 7 in total since the inception of the ESDP. 4 of these operations had been completed. It was, as you can see, the Operation Concordia in Fyrom as a successor operation of a previous NATO operation, then the Artemis operation in Congo and EUFOR Congo in 2006, which lasted 3 months, as it was the case with the Artemis operation in 2003, which included about 2,000 troops, and the 2006 operation lasted also 3 months with 2,400 troops. It was during the presidential elections for producing a secure environment for holding these elections. And then there was the EUFOR Chad operation in Central Africa, lasted about 1 year with 2,700 troops for the protection of the refugees in that area. Until then, the UN moved in with a large number of troops. 3 of the military operations, as you can see there, are still ongoing. EUNAVFOR Atalanta, since 2008, an operation against piracy between the Horn of Africa and the Indian Ocean. There are engaged about 5 to 10 frigates and about 1,450 soldiers. Then there is, as a sort of a complementing operation of the EUNAVFOR Atalanta, since 2010, the EU training mission in Somalia for training the Somalian forces. The EU has about, so the EU nations, 74 officers there. And then there is EUFOR Althea, one of the oldest and most long-lasting operations, which started in 2004 in Bosnia and Herzegovina, at that time as a successor force of NATO before and UNPROFOR before NATO. At the time in 2004, there were about 6,000 to 7,000 troops on the ground, and nowadays they are between 1,200, 1,300, around that. So in total, we have a downsize. These figures are a bit too high, from about 7,000 to 8,000 troops in 2006 to about 2,800 at present. Let's then move on to the civilian operations. There are 13 civilian operations in total. 5 of them have been completed. The Archer monitoring mission in 2004 to 2007, which was a quite successful operation because of an agreement which could be reached between the rebels in Archer and the government forces. Then there was an EU security sector reform operation in Guinea-Bissau up to 2010. Just Temis in Georgia, 2004 to 2005, a rule of law mission, and then EUPOL Proxima in Fyrom, 2004 to 2005, which was in fact a successor operation of the Concordia mission before, and then EUPAT which is a successor, or was a successor operation of EUPOL Proxima. So that was a quite successful series of operations, because it started with the military one, then had been transformed in a police mission, and then in a police training mission and a police advisory mission. Ongoing are still 8 operations, which are rule of law or police missions or border control missions. EULEX Kosovo since 2008, with about 2,800 civil servants and lawyers, which is in fact a state building mission, but I won't say more on this because Stefan Lehne will speak about that more in detail. Then EUJustLex in Iraq, which is a rule of law mission, now also in Iraq, which wasn't the case before. Then the EU police mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in parallel with about 360 police officers in parallel to the EU military mission, which is still ongoing in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Then the EU border assistance mission to Moldova and Ukraine, with about 230 customs and police officers. The EU monitoring mission in Georgia since 2008, and the crisis there, the war there, with about 400 monitors. Then in the Palestine territories, EUPOL COPS, which has its headquarters in Ramallah, with about 32 police officers, 5 of them are Palestinians. And the EU border assistance mission at Rafah crossing point, with about 70 people personnel, which had sometimes was so to say out of steam because of the upheavals in the Gaza Strip, but then has been resumed with about 70 people of personnel. And then the police mission in Afghanistan, with about 500 police officers. All in all, in the minimum, about 4,000 personnel in civilian missions, which is nearby the double of the personnel in military operations. Well, how can we evaluate this? The EU seems to have, obviously, some sort of a comparative advantage in civilian missions. Of these missions, very important is without any doubt the EULEX mission in Kosovo, also the monitoring mission in Georgia, and is a very important as some sort of a preventive mission, even if they cannot move into Abkhazia and certain other areas. And very successful, I mentioned that already, was the Aceh monitoring mission. Then, if we come to the military side, to the military operations, most of them took place in support of the United Nations, with the UN peacekeepers already there on the spot, or becoming reinforced. This was the case with Artemis, EUFOR Chad, and also with EUFOR Congo. And I also mentioned other types of ground operations, such as the Concordia, or in Bosnia, the Althea operation, which are successor operations of NATO after, so to say, a mitigation of the conflict. If we look at the military side, the importance of the operation, I think Althea is still important, still ongoing, because there is no stability in that country that one could say, let's withdraw the troops and also the police mission there. Also important for a certain limited amount of time was certainly Artemis nearby Bunia in eastern Congo, and EUFOR Congo during the presidential elections, and certainly also the Chad mission for protecting civilians and refugees in that area, and for preparing or bridging UN missions. But all in all, we can say that the EU intervenes militarily when there is an overseeable risk, an overseeable amount or span of time. If we not take a view of the mission in the Atalanta operation, which is still ongoing, But basically, it's an overseeable risk, a limited amount of time for the military engagement. And if we look at the Petersburg tasks, it is definitely the case that the EU is more operating at the lower end of the Petersburg tasks than at the upper end, which is more the case for NATO operations, and a typical case for enforcement operations, as we could see it in the case of the enforcement of the no-fly ban over Libya. So it was in the end NATO which acted in more severe cases in Libya, in Afghanistan, or in Kosovo, when it was the case to secure peace in Afghanistan also by the use of force, or to enforce UN resolutions as it was the case in Libya earlier on this year. Having said that, we could assume that it is difficult to identify the EU as a major international actor. Certainly an actor, and with some potential in specific areas of civilian missions and maybe a specific type of military missions. I come back to it. But all in all, difficult to define the EU as a major international actor. On that point, I will take up one issue also mentioned by Robert Cooper earlier this morning. And this is about power and conflict resolution. It is definitely a difficult question. What is power in today's world? Is it military power? Is it air power? Is it army power? Is it navy power? Can we induce political system change by the use of military power? Can we promote democracy by military intervention, which is a real question? And obviously the answer is very vague on that. And in many cases we will be confronted with a certain amount of disillusion. Also, had been mentioned this morning, might be power must be defined in other categories. Market power, trading power, negotiation power. Maybe it has to do with a certain amount of a low level of sovereign debt, or a low level of state deficit, or a high level of currency reserves. Maybe that these sort of things are much more important attributes of power in the world of today than military power. If military power still plays a role, then the EU is certainly weak in this area. Maybe that the EU has the opportunity of conducting a niche policy, but again, also a niche policy is definitely not a policy of a major actor in the world. But apart from that, what are the weaknesses for the EU if we look at the military side? There are difficulties with capabilities, force generation, and financing. The Athena mechanism is time and again and still on the Council's agenda, and it seems to be very difficult here to find any reasonable new agreement. There is a lack of ammunition and reconnaissance, as we could witness also in the case of NATO's action under a strong participation and partial lead of the British and the French. It was in the end the Americans who had to deliver ammunition, drones, and things like that. We have battle groups, but they are not used. They are like a fire brigade, never used when it burns or when there is fire. I come back to this. And there are obviously incompatibilities of national interests, at least between the three major powers, between the UK, France, and Germany. The UK is frustrated from capability development within the EU. It prefers to work closely together with the United States, bilaterally, also with the French. They have concluded with the French together the British-French Defence Cooperation Treaty, and the British prefer to intervene if there is a must for intervention together with the Americans under American League in the coalition of the Willings or in the framework of NATO. And on the other side there is France, which is also frustrated from the EU and the capability development, but doesn't feel very comfortable in the framework of NATO and still wants to see a stronger EU in security term, wants to see and transform the EU in an international security actor. And there is Germany, which wants, as always, both a strong EU and a strong NATO, and if possible, no risks in operations and no costs, and once again, war as quickly as possible. So what we can see, and here I come back to strategy, which may matter, I believe, in the end, but in a sense of a more clear and simply based strategy, there is a difference in strategic culture. And if we want to overcome this, we need to come to a common definition of some sort of understanding of strategy. In a sense, where should the EU intervene and where not? And of course, there is another reason. Obviously, it still exists since the Cold War, some sort of a labor division between NATO and EU, at least in the heads of the capitals and the foreign and the defense ministries of the member states. NATO is still the one responsible for hard security, EU more for the soft side of security. And to some extent, if we look at the number of operations, 7 military and 13 civilian operations, we may still feel to define the EU as a civil power, as once Max Konstam and Lutz Hager and François Duchesne did it in the 70s. Now, why do I believe that there are reasons for a stronger Europe or for a better organized Europe? The one thing is also mentioned already by Robert Cooper, that is that the West is undergoing a significant change after the Cold War, in times of a lack of an overwhelming threat, which doesn't exist any longer. And in the first period after the end of the Cold War, we had to cope with the United States, which were interventionist, unilateralist to some extent, and preemptive. At least that was it in terms of the American strategy. And at that time, the Europeans were always concerned about the Americans. What would they do next? How could we contain them? How we could prevent things going worse? But today, we are, so to say, in phase B, which is completely different from that period. You may call it the Obama period and the other, the Bush period. And this period can be characterized by the US being on retreat, thinking more about multilateralism and burden sharing, and making a difference between wars of necessity, in which the US may also become engaged in the future, when their own strategic interests and the strategic interests of the West are at stake, or defined as being at stake. And there are wars of choice, where the US will think twice whether they should become engaged or not. And in many of these cases, in Africa or elsewhere in the field of Europe's interests or in its vicinity, it might be very much up to the Europeans to make their own decisions and to intervene by themselves. In some of these cases, we may think now we have a perfect new model, a flexible NATO model, as we could see it in the Libyan case. Libya is a pretext for future European intervention. We don't need any more or longer the type of the classical ESDP as it was designed during the whole debate about the European Constitution and the Lisbon Treaty. We have NATO as a flexible model and Libya as a blueprint for that. But the question for me is, will NATO be always available as such a toolbox? What is if the Americans have a completely different interest, which is distinguished differently from the Europeans? If they say no, or if Turkey has objections and is blocking any decisions in the Atlantic Council or any other country. So it is questionable whether this flexible sort of NATO model will always be available. What then might be the alternatives? Will we see in the future European ad hoc coalitions? I'm not very sure about that. And who should lead? Would it be the British? Would it be the French? Or the Italians, as they tried in the Libyan case at some stage, very early? And perhaps we may have also to ask ourselves whether NATO will continue to exist, whether it will exist forever, or whether it could fail. It seems to be a ridiculous question, but I think we should at least put this question forward. We should take it into consideration. And then we have also, not only on the US side, budgetary constraints, as it is a big difficulty for the US now, and which requires a rundown of the whole military complex in the United States. But we have shrinking defense budgets in Europe very much, up to 10% and more, also in the case of France and the UK. And we must imagine what duplication and a waste also of energy and money we have in Europe with 27 armies, 26 air forces and 21 navies. And a duplication in defense procurement programs. There are programs where we have 10 different national armored vehicle programs. All that is a waste of money, and it points in fact to a rationale of a greater degree of coherence and integration, and also it points to all cases of pooling and sharing of capabilities and pooling and sharing of roles and tasks, which doesn't work well at the moment, even if pooling and sharing is on the agenda of the European defense ministers and the foreign ministers for quite a while, 1.5 or 2 years, but they didn't up to now make any progress on that, has various reasons. In the end, I would make the following recommendation. I think that the European Defence Agency needs to become transformed into a real defence procurement agency, along the EU public procurement rules. And if it is necessary, and this is not possible in the framework of the 27, then I think one should do it in a group of member states which like to move forward. One needs to develop an EU strategic concept on humanitarian intervention. This is where I come back to the meta level about which Simon Duke spoke. Call it a strategy or a white book, which fiercely was resisted by the Germans, but I think that some sort of a strategic concept on humanitarian intervention, which would have 3 components, a political, an economic and a military component. Politically, it would start from demarches and would end with withdrawal of ambassadors and breakup of political relations, travel bans and that sort. Economically, it would include sanctions and asset freeze. And in the military dimension, and this is my point, it should focus on military intervention for humanitarian purposes and make this clear for the protection of civilians and refugees or for the protection of humanitarian convoys. And I think if such a concept would be set up, that it would be also something on which Germany could agree, as we could witness during the debate in Germany on EU4 Libya, which is still somewhere, I think, on the homepage of the European External Action Service, and would come into being, provided that there was a request of UN, of OCHA, of the coordination on humanitarian aid, which didn't happen up to now. And I think that one should need to transform the battle group concept into a concept where the battle groups would be deployable, and that one would need to have them for 1.5 years for a 3-term presidency. And this would mean to have in 1.5 years about 10,000 to 12,000 troops available. that they would have to include an air and naval component, airlift, and also helicopters for tactical transport. They need to be jointly equipped. Here it comes back to joint procurement programs in the European Defence Agency. And they need to be jointly trained. And they need to have some sort of an operational headquarter in Brussels and a standing command to make it working and also to make it serious vis-à-vis NATO and the outside world. And if all that is not possible among the 27, and if the British are still blocking every move in that direction, there was in July a meeting where many of the member states, in fact up between 23 up to 26, were in favor of thinking about establishing an operational headquarter at the EU Secretariat General. But it was blocked by the UK. Maybe also with the Czech Republic and the Irish were very reluctant on that. But as far as I know, Austria was on the side of those who were in favor of it. If that is not possible to move forward at 27, one should try to do it by using the permanent structured cooperation, which hasn't been used up to now, because Germany and others are frightened about it, what it would mean in practice. But if one could limit it to a certain concept of the use of troops to the battle groups and link the humanitarian intervention to a new battle group concept, I think this might be something to be agreed upon. And if we would do that, this is my last sentence, then I believe it would not be necessary to organize a farewell party for Europe as an international actor. Europe would have some sort of a strategy and military capability to intervene, and it would need to strengthen its civilian missions and learn the lessons from ULEX Kosovo and other areas, and needs to get its act together on the economic and financial side, which is at present, I believe, a prerequisite for all new, better organization of Europe, also in external affairs and in the case of military operations. This is a precondition, but if that would be possible, and maybe Europe needs 1 or 2 or 3 years for that, but we should still take this time and hopefully make it work and organize it better in the end. Thank you.